Mike Roberts and Bill Barley.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts with Bill Barley, our tour guide for all over British Columbia, Northern Washington, Alberta, and we've had it other places too. I understand this is going to be sort of a family album show in a way.
Well, I hesitate to call it that, Mike, but the reason it is because my grandfather, FRS Barley, went up into the Stikine area, and the Stikine area is one of those areas of British Columbia that hasn't been well chronicled historically. And he went up there in 1897, stayed through 98, into 99, and he took 84 photographs. Out of those 84 photographs, about 20 survived. And out of those 20, most of them are on Kelowna and Telegraph Creek.
Now, what kind of a character is this man, FRS Barley?
Well, came from Lakefield, Ontario, which was very close to Peterborough. Old family, Strickland family and the Barley family, and decided to make his fortune in the West. And came out to British Columbia in 1897, left from Victoria, and actually went north into Wrangell, Fort Wrangell, which is an old American post on the Alaska Panhandle. And from there he goes inland, and eventually he goes from Kelowna to Telegraph Creek up to a place called Log Cabin, very almost unknown in British Columbia history. And then he drops, he was going to Teslin Lake, but he drops into Atlin instead because the Atlin rush started.
Okay. Now, was he a miner by trade? What was his background?
Actually, he was a newspaper man in many respects. He was supposed to be working for the Globe and Mail. I don't think he ever filed any reports for them. He got caught up in the rush, Mike. You know, like many other men, he started earlier than most of the sourdoughs went into the Klondike in 98. He was there in 97, relatively early in 97. But he chose the wrong route. There were many routes into the Yukon district or the Klondike goldfields. And some of them are overland, some of them through Chilkoot Pass, some of them through White Pass, some of them the Edmonton route, some of them through the central part of British Columbia, some through the Stikine and Log Cabin. That's the route he chose.
He made other mistakes, too, as you alluded to me, but we'll tell those stories a little bit later. Take a break here, but be back in a second to take a look at the Stikine country of British Columbia and the trials and tribulations of one FRS Barley. Don't go away. Trails and Ghost Towns, Mike Roberts with Bill Barley, talking about a relative of Bill's, one of his grandfathers, FRS Barley, fresh out of Ontario, eager to experience the West. Was he sort of a dude?
Well, not exactly, Mike. I'll tell you why he wasn't a dude, because our family participated in the building of the Peterborough canoes, so he was an expert canoesman. Mm-hmm. And when he got into this country, he knew how to handle himself. He could actually fall out of a canoe and get into the canoe in a few seconds. And in a river like the Stikine, that is really quite remarkable. One of the most dangerous rivers in the north. And so he lands at Wrangell, and his first impressions are rather interesting. Here's what he says in his original diary.
He's a diarist as well, is he?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I was up at 7:30. The gentleman who deals the faro game sleeps in the same room. He's a pleasant, mild-mannered man, but he carries a big revolver. I am very polite. And he mentions the same thing, that the Montana Kid has been sent down.
The Montana Kid?
The Montana Kid has been sent down with a dispatch to the San Francisco Examiner, and he is given $1,000 in gold dust to carry that dispatch plus his fare. And all these guys had nicknames. He says, nobody is Mr. here. There is Dandy Dick, Bohemian Joe, Cassiar Jim, and Bill, who is commonly called the bad man from Bitter Creek. He always carries a revolver and a Bowie knife. Almost every man was armed.
So the potential for very rough stuff existed here all the time.
Yeah, that was in Wrangell. That's on the American side in the Alaska Panhandle. And now he starts to move inland, and he moves inland to a little place almost unknown in the history of the West, Kelowna. Nothing left, virtually nothing left there today.
Yeah?
On the northern banks of the Stikine.
What was leading him? The knowledge that there was gold in the region, or what?
He's taking that route up through Kelowna and Telegraph Creek, which they said was one of the alternate routes into the Yukon, into the Klondike gold fields. And it's a darn tough route.
And this is early again? You said he's even there before the sourdoughs of 98?
Yes, he is. Okay. Yeah. And he buys a camera for $3, He gets 84 plates and all the developing equipment. And some of the photographs, most of the photographs we're going to be seeing are from this $3 camera.
This first photograph, a great example of, he really took pretty good photographs with this $3 camera.
Excellent photographs. He had a great eye. And here's the mounted police post in Glenora. And there's a man in charge of it. And this is a guy called Malcolm McLean. And another guy, one of his sidekicks there is a guy called Waldron, F. Waldron.
So Waldron's which guy, the one with his head
Malcolm
down?
McLean is on the left of the photograph. Waldron is looking right at you. And just on Waldron's, next to Waldron, is a guy called Todd. He's one of the traders there. And an interesting little town, Mike, because there was a parson in town, and he lived in the jail, which was kind of typical of the
safe
time.
Place to live?
Oh, sure. And everybody, you scrambled for room. And usually sometimes there were 6 or 8 guys to one room, sometimes a dozen. Depends how big the room was.
Because habitation's at a premium, I guess, with all those people around.
Well, sure.
Look at this. This is a Royal Mounted Police tunic.
This is a Northwest Mounted Police.
Ah.
Okay, it has all the Northwest buttons, the Northwest collared dogs. I'm missing the shoulder flashes, unfortunately. But it's a later Northwest, and so the Northwest was from 1873 till just after the turn of the century, and then the Royal Northwest came after that, Mike, and then finally the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. One of the most colorful uniforms, probably the most well-known police uniform in the world.
It certainly, would this be the order of the day? Would they wear the red serge all the time?
They wore the red serge all the time. We'll see it in every photograph. The mounted police were there in Glenora, and they wore the red serge. They came out like on parade dress. It was really quite remarkable.
Well, that's the Strickland you mentioned. Was he not a Northwest Mounted Policeman himself?
Yes. My great-uncle was in charge of Tagish Post and built all the forts in the Yukon for the Northwest Mounted Police.
Sure.
He was directly under Sam Steele.
This shot is, I guess, Meet the Boat is important in every story we talk about, but this is a little bit of a different game.
Yeah, it is, because everybody came down to the boat, especially if there was a woman on board, because women were at a definite premium, Mike, and they just didn't see women in the North. Yeah. And, in fact, my grandfather said when they all rushed down to the boat and they saw a young girl getting off the boat, she's 18 years old, she's just married, and her husband is bringing her north. And he says he must be stark staring mad to bring a young woman into this country.
Would they have...
But that didn't stop him from going down and looking at her.
No. Were these polite people? I mean, this must have struck fear into the heart of the average young woman who arrived there, but was there malice in their going down look at her or anything?
In all the annals of the North, women were treated extremely well. It was really the order of the day. It was really quite remarkable. It was a lawless society in many respects, but women were treated exceptionally well.
So there turned out to be about how many in Glenora? How many women finally
there were 4 women in Glenora, and there were several hundred men, so it was probably about 100 to 1, and that was about the ratio in that particular time.
Yeah. Glenora, town like all others that springs up.
Sure, and this is another little store in Glenora itself, and it's kind of interesting. This is Sean Tomlinson, typical of one of the stores in Glenora. They had supplies, and as the guys moved into town, they'd give them supplies or sell them supplies so they could go north over through Chesley Summit and down through Log Cabin.
That was no mean feat building that building. That was a wide-span building.
Oh, sure it was. Sure it was.
The first snow would have collapsed it undoubtedly, I suppose.
Well, I don't know. The log cabins were pretty well made, Mike.
Yeah.
They'd last for years. In fact, they were still standing in 1912, a lot of those buildings.
Did your grandfather leave notes as to why he took that shot, or was it just sort of a sign of the times, growing building?
Well, he did put on the back of each photograph, you know, quite often the individuals noted in the photograph what store it was and the date. So it was pretty well documented.
And this is all still before the rush of '98.
And here's a guy called Johnny Richards. He names this guy. He's the storekeeper in Glenora. And he's coming outside in his bare feet. And one of the guys is kidding him about it. So it may be some risque comments have passed here. And he's pointing to Richards' bare feet. Richards is explaining why he has bare feet in the late fall of 1898.
And it looked like a morning shot or a late evening shot, one or the other.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I would think later in the day, so that's why they're making a big fuss of Richards coming out in bare feet.
With all of these stories that you're aware of, I mean, a movie obviously demands to be made.
Oh,
Curtis Tulk.
Yeah, this is in Telegraph Creek, which is not too many miles upriver from Old Glenora. And this is Curtis and Tulk, and this is another store there. And it had several hundred people as well, all kind of a stepping-off spot into the gold fields of the north. And all these guys, Mike, the interesting thing that I find about it, every one of those men, almost without exception on the way in, was absolutely determined that they would make their pile, as they said in those days. That was the term. And in fact, my grandfather mentions a guy called Otterson, whom he knew quite well. And Otterson ran up the Hawaiian flag, and they ran up the Hawaiian flag quite often because the Hawaiian flag had the American stripes on it and the British Union Jack. So it kind of, half these guys were American, half of them were Canadian or English, mostly Canadian. And so it suited the times. And the interesting thing about it, that Otterson, whom my grandfather mentions, later came out, about 1 year later, with somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000 in gold, which would be the equivalent today of several $1 million in gold.
And Otterson just...
Two were discovered first. We'll mention those in another program sometime. But he went north. He went farther back, and he discovered a creek which was spectacular, of one of those trinity of creeks, and they called it McDame Creek after him. And it was a coarse gold creek, and he made that discovery in the early 70s. He is still here in 1898, as we see in that photograph. So he's an old man now, but he's there in 26 years later when the second great rush materializes.
Looks like quite a dandy, too, you know.
Oh, yes.
All got that snazzy Stetson on. And
well-dressed.
Was he at all an anomaly? It was a novelty to see a black man in the north of the Yukon?
Quite unusual. Not like the early days in the Fraser, but in the Yukon, quite unusual.
Any discrimination, or did each man, you know, post out his own ground through which you didn't walk?
No, I don't think so. He's in the group photograph. He certainly belonged there. He was an old-timer in that Telegraph Creek district, so he was accepted by people.
Harry McDame.
Harry McDame.
This didn't even get a name, this place.
No, this is this is possibly Telegraph Creek. I think it probably is Telegraph Creek, but it could be Glenora. And no name, hotel and restaurant, and there they are, and the dogs, of course, are out front. And this, remember, Mike, was taken with a camera that cost $3, very sharp image, and he had a good eye.
Did the dogs perform any function apart from getting their picture taken? I mean, did they scare off bears or howl at the moon or what?
Some guys use dogs in the dead of winter, but not a lot of them, you know.
There's quite a little covey of people around that place. Those would be the people that occupied that hotel, or was it just...
Yeah, they're biding their time, Mike. They're waiting till the time is right, and they have to head over Chesley Summit and make their way into Teslin Lake and then down the Yukon River itself and into the Klondike goldfields.
So they're just in the starting block, so to speak.
Here's one of the old-timers. Actually, this guy was pictured in front of Highland's General Store in Kelowna, and he's having problems. He's got his burro there, and Highland's standing behind him, and the guy is tapping his head saying, my gosh, what did I forget? So he did forget something, and he was probably too old at that particular time to participate in the rush into the Klondike goldfields.
But he fit the character. I mean, the beard, the grizzled beard.
Oh, sure. Some of these guys, Mike, people find it hard to believe, some of these guys were still active miners well into their 80s. And this did not change, you know. I mean, that happened even during my experience. Guys were still mining on certain creeks in their 90s, not 80s.
I guess if they got through the late 20s and the early 30s, which is when probably most of them died, because they were green and unskilled, then you could live on as long as your spite would allow you.
I mean, you know, because it was always anticipation what the next day was going to bring. Now, the next day might not bring anything, but that was the anticipation was part of the lifestyle.
How long did your grandfather spend at Glenora?
Well, he spent 1897, 1898, and then he starts in 1899. He starts up Chesley Summit. And kind of interesting, because when he starts up Chesley Summit, he leaves in the pack train here, and he takes this photograph, and there's the pack train starting out.
Now, something tells me that this is not good country for horses.
No, it isn't. And then they bed down for the night, and they turn the horses out to forage. And eventually, and they take that so far, and then they stop, and then they go to dogs and sleighs. And he makes a comment here. He's heading up Chesley Summit, and he's with a partner of his, and it's very tough going. And this is when partnerships tend to break up. But his didn't. They both had the good sense not to say too much. That was the main thing. You never said too much. And you can read about it in various books and chronicles of the North, where if a guy started saying something to the other partner, things really got out of hand. For instance, there was a story in Glenora where one of his two guys were partners and come up the river together, had been together for over a year, and the other partner pulled his partner's leg to wake him for breakfast. And his partner said, if you do that again, I'll shoot you. And the guy reached over, playfully pulled his leg, partner pulled out his gun, shot him between the eyes. And,
ruined the rest of his day.
Sure it did.
What a hideous... oh, I guess maybe you had to realize that you were dealing with hair-trigger personalities here.
Well, sure you were. And I was going to say, when you got into a place like Chesley Summit, which was just before Log Cabin, very, very tough going. You know, it was as tough as White Pass, as tough as Chilkoot in many respects, because it was a long grind. And my father noticed one, at least my grandfather noticed one guy coming out of the gold fields that he had known. He strapped to a sleigh. The body is being taken back to Telegraph Creek to be sent back to Victoria. And the guy's name was Mowat. And, you know, that almost brings to mind some of the service poems. You know, he was lashed to the sleigh and he raved all day of his home in Tennessee. And before nightfall, a corpse was left of Sam McGee.
These actual images were they were drawn from actual circumstance.
Oh, sure they were. And this is, my grandfather now gets into Atlin, and he is told that, and this is in 99, and my great-uncle had actually staked some ground for my grandfather, which he wasn't allowed to do. He was Northwest Mounted Policeman, in charge of the post. Yeah. He'd staked some ground on Spruce Creek. And that particular shot we were just looking at was a place called Surprise, which is about 8 miles from Atlin, just down from the shores of Lake Surprise. And you had some amazing creeks, which are still yielding, Mike. The two great creeks in British Columbia, there's Williams Creek in the Caribou, and there's Spruce Creek in the Atlin district. And Spruce Creek has probably yielded over 500,000 ounces, troy ounces of gold. My grandfather had 23 above on Spruce, which I mentioned very briefly in one other program.
23 above, what did that mean again?
Now, 23 above means that there was a discovery claim, and the discovery claim would be 0 or 1. And then one claim above that would be 1 above, and 2 above would be 2 above. 5 below it would be 5 below. So this is the
so
practice of naming the claims.
23 claims away from the first big strike.
That's right, but he had actually, he was just below the Blue Canyon. He had a very, very good claim, but he walked away from it. You know, people were very strange in that particular time, because here he had one of the great claims in the Atlin district, on the greatest creek in the Atlin district, but it was deep ground. And he heard about a rush over in Morse Creek, and a guy came over and showed him 1.5 pounds of gold that he'd dug out of Morse Creek in a month. And my grandfather walked away from his claim on Spruce Creek, went over to Morse Creek, and mined about 10 cents worth of gold.
Does anybody know how much 23 above eventually paid out?
Well, it was a multi-million-dollar claim. Oh, multi-million-dollar claim. And right in the heart of Spruce Creek, where old guys like Nolan mined many years later and discovered the native Aaron and the four-leaf clover and all these magnificent pieces of ground.
Well, did your grandfather, I mean, did he begin talking to himself or anything, or was he beyond that? I mean, was he into the photographing and the experiencing of the thing?
Well, here's a shot of Atlin, which is kind of interesting, and this shows Atlin in 1898. And Atlin was booming at that time, 20 saloons and hotels, going 24 hours a day. You couldn't sleep in Atlin town. You had to go on the outskirts because they were shooting off guns and they were drinking and yelling and the click of the roulette wheels and everything else. It was a real boom town. And so he stays in Atlin for right through 1899. And then finally, it's taken him 2 years, Mike. Finally, he decides to make the long trip. And the goal that he was heading for, which is the Klondike gold fields. So he starts moving north, and we leave him there, really.
These are the way they work the claims?
That's right. Now, this is a very interesting shot. This is Gold Hill, and this is the famous White Channel in the Yukon, discovered by a guy from the Caribou, actually. And they're working with rockers, and they have a windlass, so they're...
Just on the right of the screen there?
That's right.
So this is, again, what you're calling deep ground?
Yeah, this is really quite deep ground. And so they, in spots. Now, in other places it wasn't. But this was an old channel, a pre-glacial channel that they discovered in the early years of the Klondike Rush and produced hills like French Hill and Gold Hill and Chicago Hill and El Dorado and Jews Hill and dozens of them. And it was, foot for foot, it was remarkable ground.
Big country. Okay. But that's another story, right?
Yes, it is.
Beyond that.
Our second trip into the Yukon.
What are we going to do in a minute? What's coming up?
Well, there are several treasure stories in that area around Dease Lake, essentially around Dease Lake and McDame Creek and a little creek called Defoe Creek. So we're going to mention 2 of them.
All right. Take a break. You know, don't you love a guy with a camera when he goes into the country? I wish we could preserve video the same way.
Yeah.
Take a break. Be back in a second to find out what treasure awaits near McDame Creek. Don't go away. Fine glass like this that prospectors could discover whether or not there was any gold in them Nar hills.
Yeah.
You didn't need a glass like this to look at the nugget that we've got a shot of here. How big is this nugget?
Well, it's 73 ounces, over 6 troy pounds. Troy pounds, 12 ounces to a pound, discovered by a guy called Alfred Freeman on McDame Creek, and that's what this story's about, Mike. If you took this and filled it with gold, you'd have about 375 to 400 ounces. In 1876, 4 miners were working on the north side of McDame Creek, a guy called Vital LaForce, Rufus Sylvester, and a guy called Christie. Forget the fourth one. And they were taking out up to 400 ounces, hand-digging on a magnificent lead off to the side of the creek. They were working along on that lead day by day, doing exceptionally well. Thought it would go on forever. They discovered an old channel. Suddenly, towards the end of 1876, still getting magnificent gold. Next day she cut off like that. The run simply disappeared.
Where do they disappear? What's the component that makes a run disappear?
Well, sometimes a glacier came through the area, wiped out what we call an interrupted run. And that could have happened there, although it's a steep-sided valley if you've been on McDame Creek. So that's questionable. Or the creek could have taken an abrupt turn, and the present creek wiped it out. So we don't know whether the Christie lead continues, whether it's lost forever, whether it's on the south side of the creek or the north side of the creek. It's a guessing game, Mike.
Have you tested your guesses?
Not really. I know guys up there who have. George Zimmich and a lot of guys who've looked for the lost Christie lead, which is close to a little branch called Snow Creek.
376 ounces a week for how long? A year?
Oh, they were there for month after month after month, and I'd have to check my records to find out exactly how long they were. Went hundreds and hundreds of feet following this old lead.
Did they manage to keep this a secret to themselves and basically become rich?
Can't keep it, Mike. You can't keep a secret. Gold always out.
All righty. Bill Barley, thank you for coming in today. Fascinating photographs taken by Bill's grandfather, FRS Barley, yeah. And who knows where we'll go next time when Gold Trails and Ghost Towns continue. Bye-bye.